The Rings of Power has received a lot of hate from the internet. In fact, judging by the World Wide Web, folks are at best upset about the show's creative direction, which by itself is fine and valid. It's okay to not enjoy something after all. But at worst, the internet's angry about the show's diverse casting, the prominence of female characters like Galadriel, or have vague criticisms about how the show is quote-unquote woke, which is an umbrella of complaints so large that even the LGBTQ community would be impressed. Though I say would because the only people who really use the word woke in sincerity are people who equal shit. You know, racists, homophobes, transphobes, and misogynists who hide their said racism, homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny behind vague language like woke. The type of language that rage-bait content creators spew about media with diverse casts, female empowerment themes, and even the inkling of gay. Media like Amazon's The Rings of Power, because truly there's enough hate on the internet here to give Sauron a Barad-dûr-sized stiffy, because hatred is the all-seeing eyes Pornhub. That perv. And in regards to the online hate directed at the Rings of Power, whether fair criticisms or whatever the fuck people upload to YouTube, may the content last forever, that's honestly too bad, because if you were to ignore the riffraff spouted by the usual suspects regarding how the Lord of the Rings is quote-unquote ruined now, you'd actually find a show that was overall solid, if unspectacular. Yeah, it has a lot of problems, which we'll get to very shortly, but as a series, it clearly adores both the Peter Jackson trilogy and the original J.R.R. Tolkien text, albeit in a way that feels true in spirit rather than accurately following the source material, because let's be clear, it really doesn't. It kind of pulls a Fleetwood Mac and goes its own way. But regardless, The Rings of Power feels faithful in terms of style. The show is gorgeously shot, the action is well choreographed, and all the fantasy elements like the conflict between the various races like the elves, humans, and the dwarves are very layered and interesting. It all feels very lively. Yet the most interesting aspect of this prequel series is that it's set in an era of Middle-earth that is very different from the one present in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because in that story, Middle-earth was a continent in societal decline and decay. It was a world of which its better days were behind it, and with the Rings of Power, we see those aforementioned better days, because you know, it's a prequel. Orcs haven't been seen in centuries, Sauron is believed to be dead, even despite Galadriel searching, and the elven architecture and the dwarven craftsmanship are pristine. Like, I could wipe my ass with their architectural marvels, and they'd still look kingly. And truly, it's fascinating to see so many of Middle-earth's various factions at their pinnacle, and it is so for two reasons. Firstly, because it's visually stunning. Like, let's be clear, the show is beautiful, and a nice tourism ad for New Zealand, because the amount of money Amazon spent here is visually tangible. And the second reason why the Rings of Power's setting is fascinating is because we all know that it will end in tragedy. The show has to pave the way for the Lord of the Rings after all, the aforementioned era of societal decline that was thousands of years in the making, just like the British Empire. It all has to fall down in order to get where it's supposed to go, which is fascinating. Admittedly, The Rings of Power does have a fair few faults that prevent the show from being an overwhelmingly positive experience. For those who have seen the original trilogy, this season's twists are fairly predictable if you know where to connect the dots. Like, it's pretty obvious who Sauron is supposed to be. The show starts slow and takes an episode or two to get its feet under it. Some of the writing is too blunt and forced in terms of characters stating who they are and why they are important. It commits the unfortunate sin of just not being as good as Peter Jackson's trilogy, which isn't really the show's fault, but it's worth mentioning because wow, did that trilogy spoil us rotten. And overall, The Rings of Power really changes and condenses the events covered in the Silmarillion, which was a lore-filled prequel book released posthumously, i.e. after Tolkien had already deceased. Like, there's so many events in that book taking place thousands of years apart, yet The Rings of Power pulls on many of these threads, many of which aren't portrayed accurately at all, and presents them as if they occur all at the same time. Like, there's a lot of character building for Galadriel, Elrond, Isildur, people related to Isildur, a spoiler character, and another spoiler character. It's a lot of expansive lore that happens simultaneously and in a streamlined fashion. It's like a very condensed and not very accurate version of the Silmarillion, though admittedly that is not really much of a problem given that the Silmarillion itself isn't all that great. Like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of fascinating lore and world building in that book, but it's not exactly an interesting story. It's honestly very dry, even drier than the rest of Tolkien's work, which is fucking saying something. It's like a wheat sandwich in desperate need of mayonnaise. And due to this, The Rings of Power rightfully alters the material and condenses that shit in order to make a cohesive narrative that can fit on a television screen and could be followed along with ease. And honestly, that was overall the correct creative decision, because truly, The Rings of Power actually has narrative rhythm. It is the storytelling mayonnaise that the Silmarillion desperately needed. And with that, yes, I do recommend The Rings of Power Season 1. It's overall a solid Lord of the Rings show that stays true to the spirit of both the Jackson films and Tolkien's work, albeit with a script that could have used another pass. It overall has exquisite visuals and deep lore that fantasy lovers can sink their sharp little toothers into, because despite what some angry people on the internet might say, The Rings of Power Season 1 is fine enough on its own and not worth getting mad about. It's decent enough. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you thought of The Rings of Power Season 1. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto my Discord server, and $5 a month allows you to start making review requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.